7 months after Michael Brown was killed, some are still mourning. Some are ready to move on. But the spotlight returned to the St. Louis area with the release of the Department of Justice investigation. Resignations and firings followed in Ferguson. So is this the beginning of the change so many have called for, or just personnel shuffling for show? Tonight, what's ahead for Ferguson? How do we take what we learned from the DOJ and move the entire region forward? Stay tuned. And on Stay Tuned, you drive the discussion. We bring local experts, journalists, and civic leaders together to have tough conversations for a stronger St. Louis. Tweet us your insights on tonight's topic, and you've got a seat at the table. With a few national experts and a panel of community members, this is the show bringing more light and less heat to the issues that matter. So stay tuned. Two weeks ago, the Department of Justice released its findings in its investigation of the Ferguson Police Department. Some were surprised by what it said. Others felt validated that the feds found what they'd been saying all along. The Department of Justice launched two investigations after the death of Michael Brown, one concerning his death and another probing the entire Ferguson Police Department. Federal investigators said the evidence did not support charges against the officer who shot and killed Brown, but the agency compiled nearly 100 pages implicating the police department in a, quote, pattern and practice of unlawful conduct.
People feel under assault and under siege by those who are charged to serve and to protect them.
The DOJ based its report on hundreds of interviews with citizens.
You go to court, you don't have the money for the ticket, you wind up in jail. It's just a cycle, an endless cycle.
They see me as a threat. That's why I'm here, because there has to be some voice to it. If there's no voice to it, there's no change.
And investigators also compiled data from Ferguson Police Department records and interviews with officers, police department leadership, and city and municipal court officials. With pages of personal testimony and hard data, the DOJ says the city of Ferguson uses its police department and municipal court not to promote public safety, but to build revenue, often on the backs of those who can least afford it. To start the conversation with us here tonight, joining us once again on the program, two gentlemen who've been here before. We appreciate you being back. Thomas Harvey from Arch City Defenders and John Ammon, St. Louis University Law School, also the supervisor of the litigation clinic. When I said that some folks are ready to move on, I'm talking about well-meaning individuals who also may live in Ferguson, want to work for change, but they're maybe tired of talking about this publicly. They're kind of tired, and there's a certain just a certain exhaustion that they feel when you just use the word Ferguson, which we know means more than the city limits of Ferguson itself. So help us set the stage here a little bit. Not everyone's had time to read all 106 pages. How bad is it? How did it read when you saw it?
Well, it confirms what our clients have been telling us all along, which is this isn't about public safety, it's about the money, and they're being pulled over because they're black and they're being exploited, and it has destroyed the trust between city government, police, courts acting in unison to hurt a certain segment of the population, and that community is distrustful of the government as a result of it. And the DOJ report went into things in more detail than other reports, but John Ammon and I and the SLU Law Clinics have been doing work for years on this, as well as other members of the community. And more importantly, for folks impacted by these policies, this is nothing new. It's for folks who haven't set foot in those courts and haven't been stopped by the police in the region that this is new information.
We have a quote from the report here. It says, when police and courts treat people unfairly, unlawfully, or disrespectfully, law enforcement loses legitimacy in the eyes of those who have experienced or even observed the unjust conduct. This is not just, we saw folks who were there giving their stories to the interviewers, the investigators, this report is not just anecdotal or even personal stories. There was data behind this to back up what you're saying as well, correct?
Absolutely.
Right.
And Casey, the DOJ report also made a point to say that the practices in Ferguson have made the community less safe. So not only is it abusive and oppressive to the people who, African Americans primarily, people who have to line up in the cold and go to municipal court on nights like tonight and wait to have their tickets heard, that in addition to that oppression, we don't gain anything with public safety. It's hurting public safety to have this system.
Of course, some would say you don't have to line up and go to court if you don't speed. What did this report say to that? In fact, it said the officers, largely, there was a sentiment that people felt that this was a problem that could be attributed to a lack of personal responsibility on behalf of those who found themselves as defendants.
Right. What the report is able to get into that the other previous reports have not been able to get into is the attitudes of the people who run those institutions. So they have emails, they have quotes, they have interviews from people who are talking to the Department of Justice about allegations of racial profiling, and whose response is an incredibly paternalistic, racist response, which is, how else will we teach these people lessons unless we assess fines, unless we can threaten jail? So for every one person who will publicly say that to the DOJ, imagine how many more there are who are thinking that and who are exchanging private emails off of their government issued email address. So the report is shocking, I think, to me, only in the sense that they find evidence from the very people who run the institutions. You could always find people standing outside these courts who would tell anybody in the world who cared to listen to them what was going on. You could always find the Attorney General's report showing that there's a disparity in stops in Ferguson and our entire region. And you could always find on the budgets, on the websites, their budgets showing that these are the second highest or third highest source of revenue in the town. But what we haven't been able to find before the DOJ's report was admissions by the individuals running these courts and institutions that they are individually racist actors within this system.
Along those lines, something that was going around Twitter this week from the website redstate.com, which is probably self-explanatory in its title, but it's a conservative blog, conservative website. The gentleman who wrote this article said, "I intentionally disregarded all commentary regarding what the DOJ investigators reported." He basically just assumed what they said didn't matter. He could have discounted what the individual said. He said, even if you read only the parts of the Ferguson DOJ report that come directly from the files of the FPD, which is to say that would put them presumably in the most favorable light, the report paints an incredibly damning picture of the Ferguson Police Department. No conservative on earth should feel comfortable with what it had to say.
Exactly right. And Casey, on the personal responsibility issue, how many times in the last few weeks have we read stories where a municipality has not followed the law? How many cities in St. Louis County have failed to give the state auditor their report about how much traffic fines they've collected and whether they're violating the 30% of revenue that's in the state law? How many communities were late or have failed to file the report with the Missouri Attorney General about racial profiling? So if our attitude's going to be follow the law, that's got to work for the municipalities too, and it hasn't. And the problem is that we have so many municipalities, and some of them are not capable of keeping up. We heard from the mayor of Wellston this week. He said, I don't have time to respond to Sunshine Act request, to Freedom of Information Act request. And I sympathize with the police chief in Wellston. That should not be his job. But Wellston doesn't have the capacity to operate as a municipality and respond to the obligations it has at the state and federal level.
So do our municipal courts have the capacity to live up to the standards that we're going to get into in terms of changes and recommendations? Do they have, because I think we've said on previous shows, this is not just a Ferguson problem. Would you find these, if the DOJ investigated other municipalities, what would they find? Something similar?
Broadly similar, right? I mean, it would be a question of degree, but you would see constitutional violations, you would see policies and practices that disproportionately impact African Americans and poor people in our region, and you would see a general attitude within the courts that display a disregard for those folks. So would you find individual emails? I don't have any idea. But if you just looked at those numbers and you asked people on any night in this town, in any court in this town, how they feel about the courts, they would tell you essentially the same thing that you see in that report. And the answer for, the question now when we talk about reforms, we need to stop talking about a reform. We need to shift this whole narrative to say, why should these courts continue to exist? Abolition should be our starting point instead of nibbling around the edges and trying to reform slightly. The Missouri Supreme Court now has asserted very clearly that they have the authority to take over these courts. They're limiting their action right now to Ferguson's municipal court, but there's obviously no reason why they couldn't extend their actions to any other municipal court in this region.
So then St. Louis County would take care of these things just as a matter of point here. What would you suggest?
Well, there are a variety of proposals. Brendan Roediger at St. Louis University School of Law had proposed a revision to state law that would move all the courts to the Associate Circuit Court level and then allow for the individual municipalities to contract with the 4 satellite courts that we have in our region and then just pay for those courts. Right now, the numbers suggest that the municipal courts profit $52 million a year from these courts, and Better Together's report shows that it costs about $15 million a year to operate those courts when they pay individual judges and prosecutors. If they pooled that money and made a full-time professional court in those 4 satellite courts, you could do it for a lot less than $15 million a year.
So if I'm living in, I'll just pick Kirkwood, and we're running a pretty tight ship, I don't know what the court is like there, but do they lose their court too? How does this affect the broader population if we take on such a, sounds like almost like a moonshot kind of goal here?
Well, I mean, to address the moonshot thing, this is, from what we've seen in that report, in the DOJ's report, that's what we need to be thinking about, right? You couldn't be any more clear that we've got a major problem and then we need to change it. So if all you're going to do is if all it takes is the creation of 4 regional courts, let's do it. Kirkwood would, there's nothing under the law that says Kirkwood has to have its own municipal court, or Jennings does, or Pine Lawn does. Create 4 regional courts, make them professional full-time courts, staff them up, and then you would at least create the environment in which people can have the benefit of a professional court. And you isolate it to 4 different places that you have to go if you're a defendant in one of these courts. And frankly, as folks who are involved in sort of a watchdog role, it's easier for us to see what's going on in those courts too if there's only 4 places we have to go as opposed to 81.
And when you say professional, people may not realize the judges and prosecutors aren't always full-time. In fact, I think that in the report, or perhaps it was the white paper from Arch City that talked about a part-time prosecutor or a part-time judge can actually make more money than a full-time public defender in some situations.
That happens. And Casey, if I can make a point, it's great that we're talking about reforms now. Ferguson, for example, has eliminated failure to appear fines because we learned that from the DOJ report that was the #1 offense in Ferguson. So you talk about public safety. The #1 crime in Ferguson was not showing up for court. Well, how does that help public safety? But the point is, Ferguson,
courts that were hard to show up for, according to the report, in some instances where you couldn't bring your children in, or other things that the report outlined.
Some cities like Ferguson have repealed fees that were illegal. A warrant recall fee, a warrant letter fee, things that they were charging for, they've now repealed. Great step. And there's several cities in St. Louis County that were charging those illegal fees. If they wipe them out now, that's great. But here's the problem. They've been charging those fees for years. Pay the money back. We have young black men that society criticizes. Why don't you get a job? Why don't you go to school? You know why? Because some municipalities in St. Louis County took hundreds of dollars out of his pocket illegally. Some of these communities have stolen money from young black men in our community by adding fees on to their traffic cases. And we've got some litigation going now, and we're asking the courts to say, tell them to give the money back. That's the least they can do.
Real quickly, you were in Ferguson court tonight, John.
Right.
We have a new judge there. The Missouri Supreme Court put in a professional judge. Any changes, any different atmosphere?
Well, Judge Richter is a Court of Appeals judge. He's got a lot of experience, and he'll be very thoughtful about the reforms, and it's going to take him some time to get deep into the Ferguson system and see how it works. So we have hope that Judge Richter will come out of this and say, here's what needs to change in Ferguson. And Judge Richter helps train municipal judges throughout the state. So he's going to have a statewide impact. He's going to say, we're going to do this in Ferguson, and the rest of you cities should do this too. The thing that hasn't changed, that had not changed for tonight, Casey, is the makeup of the people in the courtroom. I counted about 80 people in court at 6:30 tonight. 78 of them were African American. Judge Richter can't fix that because those cases are in the pipeline. The police are writing the tickets. Yes, there are white people who get tickets and maybe hire a lawyer, but the people who can't afford a lawyer, the people who have to come to court to take care of their tickets, are hardworking African Americans from our community. And Judge Richter couldn't fix that tonight, and it's going to take a long time to fix that because of the cases in the pipeline and because of the problems we have with policing.
Thank you both. We'll leave it there for 1 minute. You mentioned young men. We sat down with some young men and women to hear what they had to say about how they think we should move forward.
It's been 7 months since the shooting death of Michael Brown and since race and law enforcement has been the trending topic across all media platforms. And every time we sit down, I always ask, where are you? How do you feel? Where are you emotionally at this point? It was first after the shooting, then after the verdict, now after the DOJ report around the Ferguson Police Department. Where are you all now?
Like, yeah, the Mike Brown stuff is over with, but I think it's been being compounded with other situations. The fraternity stuff is going on now, so it's just seemed like it's been more racist than ever in our life from 2014 to now. It's just like an extreme amount.
It's an extreme amount in the media. I don't think anything's different than how it's been. I had people who are like kind of outside of the understanding of like our relationship with the police, and when the DOJ report came out, a lot of my friends, they were like, oh my goodness, like, could you believe the things that were said in the DOJ report? I'm like, I live it every day.
What we've talked about a lot is some of the things that you'd like for people to know is to have empathy for other people's experiences. And now that the DOJ report has come out and there's actual evidence, not just experiences being talked about, but evidence of police misconduct in that police department, do you feel any vindication from that? Do you feel, I told you so, I've been talking about this?
No. I don't think that our goal was to say, I told you so, or to get a sense of us being right. It's to rectify.
Yeah, to fix.
So, like, if we have so much evidence about that specific municipality and they are still being allowed to operate, that's not vindication. That does nothing for us, because as bad as it's been for us for years, and then for other people to see it now, for them just to like, it's still like it's being sideswept. Like, oh, we're just gonna put them through a 10-step program and then that'll just change their whole thinking and everything. So it's not about, it's never been about being right.
And so you can change laws, you can try to, like you said, bring in different programs to reform the police department or do whatever you want, but when you're dealing with the same ideal and the same mindset, that's what needs to be changed. The hearts of people, the understanding of people.
Well, Maya, how has it changed you?
Well, I was going to say the most frustrating thing for me has been probably also one of the more therapeutic things and very necessary things is making sure the conversation keeps happening, both within folks who have lived it, who experienced it, that this DOJ report is nothing new to them, as well as to folks who are like just blown away by it.
You mentioned that it seems like there's more racism than there ever was, just because it's now, people are talking about it more, expressing themselves more. Words do hurt. Do you see moving forward as a possibility that there will eventually be change?
I think that there will be some type of change, and I think that there still is. And the reason why I say that is because people aren't backing down as far as the protest goes, for one. And
Are you surprised by that?
I mean, to be honest, I am. I thought that it would be, because the Trayvon Martin thing happened, and then people stopped protesting.
But I just felt a little disheartened to see the world stand up and be like, this is the most outrageous, bad thing we've ever seen, and then nothing happened still. Like, for me, that just was like, whatever. Like,
I kind of agree with what you're saying, but then again, this particular fight has only been going on for 7 months. Like, we've been struggling for a long time, but like, this fire right here has only been going on for 7 months, and yeah, it's been a bunch of slaps in the face, but it's like,
it's just like anything you want, like whether you chasing a dream, whether you fighting for, you know, equality, you don't have to get back up when you get knocked down. And like, people have been showing a great deal of resilience.
People from all different age groups and backgrounds and personal stories finding that sense of like being empowered to be able to want to help in some way, if it's out in the streets in like whatever inclement weather of the year it's in, just to like shout, literally raise their voice, because now there are people who are listening and they feel like if I don't do it, who will?
What do you need to see, or what would be something that would convince you that's a good sign? What would be a good sign to you?
I'd say the investigation of just all police departments, especially those that police poverty or impoverished Black neighborhoods, or just impoverished neighborhoods in general.
Investing into the school system and just making like education equal all across the board.
Man, because it's the youth. And our children, you know, they go to these schools and, you know, like a child's potential is limited to its environment's reach. You can have the kid who can save the entire world right here in St. Louis, but he doesn't have the education to even get a chance to do that. You know what I mean? Like we can give birth to people who can change the world, but when we steady our declining people of those opportunities, we're also declining ourselves opportunities.
I would just like to see our generation just really step in to start mentoring some of these younger people, you know, start really getting involved into some of these younger people's lives who are in poverty and don't necessarily have a way out.
It could be very unrealistic, but out of respect for Mike Brown and the lives lost, that like the killing is not at the level it usually is during this summer. That's something I would like these 3 months or the summer, I would like to see Black people be like, you know what, we're not killing each other. We gonna chill out and do right. That's what I would like to see.
That's a good one.
You don't like it? Okay, we'll keep with the theme that they started for us, which is what's next, looking forward. Let me introduce our new table. Welcome back to the show, Chris King, editorial director from the St. Louis American. Thanks for being back. Also, welcome back to Amy Hunter, director of racial justice, YWCA Metro St. Louis, and T.R. Carr, a member of the Ferguson Commission. I'll start with you, Mr. Carr. Can you kind of give us an update? Admittedly, maybe people paid a little more attention, unfortunately, to the Ferguson Commission when the meetings were contentious. But now, what's going on?
I think now we're in what I would call a listening phase. We're still gathering data. We're gathering information. We have to have a final report to the governor mid-September, and we're working in 4 areas. One, I'm co-chairing a group that is looking at municipal court operations. I'm also serving on another working group. Dan Isom is the co-chair of that one, looking at police-community relationships. We have just stood up a committee that's looking at economic development, jobs, opportunities, and another group is looking at educational opportunities. So the commission is very diligent right now, examining the issues that we face, and we hope to be able to come together with a report that does have some long-lasting impacts on our region. We may not have a lot of specifics. We want to stay out of the weeds, but we want to deal with general precepts and principles that can move our region forward. It's really a misnomer to call us the Ferguson Commission, because we really are dealing with issues that face us as a region as a whole.
Those are some heavy issues. Do you feel like you have the ear of those who can have the control over purse strings or other influencers that can make a difference when you come up with these recommendations as you go?
That remains to be seen. The reason I wanted to serve on the Ferguson Commission is because I believe in hope. I believe that we have the opportunity to have that kind of impact. I have been meeting with municipal officials myself, talking with mayors, talking about the issues that need to change. And I believe that as a result of the Ferguson Commission, as a result of the issues that we now face as a region, I think this region will come together. I think we will move forward. St. Louis is a great region, and we have great potential. And this is our time to seize it and to move forward.
I don't think anyone would say that that's a bad idea. Some people kind of feel differently about how we should do that. Amy and Chris, I'll let you jump in on this one as well, and I'll put it to you, Mr. Carr. This is from someone on Twitter. Chuck C. Baker says, I agree, and talking about something we were speaking in the last segment, but he says, however, every person immediately jumps to race as the cause. We cannot move on until we see past color. What do you think about that?
I think seeing color is a good thing. It is part of who we are. It's a wonderful part of who we are. We talk about it in our region. And it also offers an opportunity for us to see what is different. And so I think what Ferguson has highlighted for us is the different realities based upon racial identification that some people are facing, not just here in St. Louis, but across the world. And so it also offers us an opportunity to create strategies to overcome that. And I think that's where our creativity comes, that we as a region can be thoughtful and strategic about how to overcome some of the barriers and mistreatment of people based upon racial identification. We would no more ask women to give up their gender identity than we would ask people of color to give up their racial identity. I think embracing race is a good way to do it instead of trying to erase it or go to a colorblind society.
What do you think, Chris? What do you think? What do your readers think when people say, I want to move on? Some people maybe can and some people can't. Fair?
I think we should move forward. And moving forward means that we are having race conversations. Moving forward means that we are looking within our institutions, like our educational systems, like our housing, like our healthcare, and seeing where the racial disparities are, and then not in a hopeful way, but in a strategic way, creating strategies to make sure that people aren't having disparate treatment based upon race. And so that is moving forward, and I hope that they're on board with that. This isn't something that goes away. This is something that we create the reality that we'd like to see in the world, and that will take all of us, not some of us.
Someone in the youth conversation, they were young adults, I think we could tell just by listening to them, at the very least. It felt good to shout in the rain or whatever the situation was. Some folks are ready to see the shouting stop. I also hear people say, though, as one person in the segment said, it's only been 7 months. This is a fire, I think he said, that's been building for a long time. What does the quote-unquote protest movement, what do they want next?
Well, I'm not a spokesperson for the protest movement.
But you talk to a lot of them.
Well, I do, and obviously there's a lot of attention to disparate treatment of African Americans by law enforcement officials. It is a national issue. In Ferguson, you see a predatory municipal government structure that's driving the cops. I mean, the cops are kind of the first victims of the scheme because they're forced to ticket aggressively, and they're taking it out on minority motorists and homeowners. But it's also a national issue where places where they don't have the same municipal hang-ups that St. Louis County has, but you still see very violent white criminals being brought in with tasers and non-violent black men being beaten to a pulp or shot to death. So those are real issues, and if you don't like people screaming about it, then you ought to do something more systematic to address the problem, and maybe if we address the problem, we would have less screaming about the problem.
So are there individual actions? We have a list of recommendations from the federal government. What do I as an individual, what do the rest of us, what's our role in all of this?
Get involved. This is our region. You know, we all have a role to play here. And I think what we could see is that we were not as connected as we would have liked to have been, so we didn't know what was going on in neighboring communities. So get involved. I was saying earlier that, you know, at some schools, kids can't take their books home. Like, who wouldn't buy a book? I just talked to a teacher that didn't have enough paper at her school to make Xerox copies for the kids to take homework home. Get involved. This is our community. This is our home. We can do things differently.
What you're seeing on your screen right now are some of the changes that the Department of Justice recommended. We're going to talk more about these as we continue, but also things that you guys might say as well.
Well, I think one thing that I've heard is that the schools need people to come along to actively tutor young men and young women to enhance their academic skills, to increase their likelihoods for success in the workforce. The children that are attending schools that are at risk would benefit from the infusion of adults with the ability to tutor, to motivate, to show them success. I think I would agree that we have to get involved, and it's an opportunity for our churches and synagogues and civic groups to be able to aggressively get involved to help. We can do nothing if we sit back. So this is, I think it really is a call to move the region forward.
What are you guys seeing with the young adults? We have some that we just heard that were very well spoken in this taped piece that we have, but we also have a lot of young people who have maybe become active for the first time in very personal ways. They're traveling to Selma, they're traveling to Washington, D.C. Young people from around the country are coming here for their spring breaks. Is this significant? What does this do to?
Well, I think it's wonderful, truly. I mean, I've been at the St. Louis American for 10 years, and there was really two generations of young people, one that we thought were kind of lost to the streets, and the other that we kind of thought were lost to the clubs. And I mean, they're more engaged now than the people my age that were, long-term, activists and civic lovers. So it's been exciting for me to see young people that we had disregarded as not serious in some way, showing us how very serious they can be, and very inspiring to me personally.
I agree. I'm so thrilled and proud of the young people. This is their movement. They have had amazing leadership, amazing female leadership, I might add, in this movement. They have been thoughtful, they have been brave, courageous, and the reality of the situation is every social movement that's had success has been at the helm of young people. And so I think we should support them, uplift them, encourage them to use their voice. We're American citizens. This is how we get things done, through protest. And so this isn't a new phenomenon. And we're looking forward to the positive changes that come because of their leadership.
And I should point out the DOJ report also talked about the kind of speech that you might hear if you're out there at the protest, and you might not agree with the tone or even the vulgarity, quite frankly, or some of the things that are written on the sidewalk in chalk. Sure. But that's protected speech as well.
I read a book, it's a religious book, A Long Obedience in the Same Direction. And I think if we're going to build our region, it's a long road. And that means that I applaud the young adults that are spending their alternative spring breaks in our region. But this really calls for more than a few weeks. It calls for a month-long, a year-long, a decade-long effort to motivate, to equip, to train, to be sure that the next generation does have the opportunities, and that's what it's about. So it's not something that's going to be resolved overnight. At the same time, in terms of relationships with local officials, we need to spend some time working with the local officials who are elected by the public, and to begin to explain the issues and to see them move in the same direction as well. It takes a cooperative effort by individuals, by municipal governments, by state, and probably by federal officials as well.
Thank you all. Don't go too far. We have, as we often do, almost a parallel conversation going on online. So let's go back to social media, dip into that conversation, and get a sampling of that. One person who has not been shy about sharing his thoughts on a variety of topics over the last 7 months is the now former St. Louis County Police Chief Tim Fitch. We had the opportunity to sit down with him earlier this week.
Fragmentation of law enforcement is an issue everywhere in this country, but not as bad as we see it here. This is really a problem that's confined to St. Louis County, even when we talk about the state. Not that there's not police abuses as far as ticket writing that happen in other areas of the state, because they do. Just not the concentration like we see in St. Louis County. And it's very difficult to try to coordinate law enforcement services when you have 65 different police departments operating within one county. If you have local officials, mayors and councils, city managers, finance directors, telling the police chief, we don't have money, we need money. One way to get money, send the cops out, have them write more tickets. Well, if the police officers are out writing tickets and they're on the interstate highway like we see in front of the airport with St. Anne all day long, there's little else that you can be doing while you're sitting alongside the highways related to community policing. So what we've seen is a lot of these cities, because of financial reasons, divert their police resources from community policing into revenue generation. And that was a big piece of the DOJ report, was the discussion about how cities are forcing their police departments. I do not blame the police officers at all. I blame the elected officials. The blame lies squarely at their feet, and they need to be held responsible and accountable for that. So it helps in any community to have your police department reflect the makeup of the community. That sounds good, but it's very difficult to do. It's very difficult to do. In St. Louis County, for example, if you're an African American candidate to be a police officer, you immediately went to the first area of processing. We'd have at any given time 700 applications from white males. But at any given time we'd have about 30 from African Americans. We always process the African Americans first, which may not sound fair, but we had such a difficult time recruiting African Americans that we had to get them as soon as they came in the door and bring them on board and hopefully process them quickly and get them into our department before they went somewhere else. It is very difficult. I don't care where you're at. And I don't believe that Ferguson or any other department intentionally does not hire African Americans. It's just very difficult to recruit. What I think is going to happen here, and will happen as a result of the Department of Justice investigation in Ferguson, even though that Department of Justice investigation keyed in on Ferguson, the Attorney General and the DOJ made it very clear that he doesn't just believe this is a Ferguson issue in this area, that this is an issue going around mostly in North County, but in a number of cities in St. Louis County. I believe every problem is fixable. And it could be, there could be some real drastic changes to law enforcement in our area as a result of it. As a matter of fact, I believe there will be. I think that if the state's proposed statute that will reduce the amount of revenue that cities can collect from fines, if that happens, you're probably going to see about 20 cities in North St. Louis County go out of business because of that, because of the revenue issue in 5 years or less. So that's going to create a huge amount of change in that area. They no longer can rely on their police departments to generate revenue for their cities. Well, if the cities can't exist because they don't have the money, they will continue to reduce their services. I call it dumbing down their services, reduce services, until they get to the point where they can't offer services at all. And that's when they'll have to make some of those drastic decisions.
So Thomas Harvey is back at the table. T.R. Carr and Amy Hunter are still here. Joining us now is Dave Leipoltz, Community-Based Study Director, Better Together, STL. Well, let's just jump right in from what the chief was saying. Are you buying what he's saying? He just said, I believe 20 municipalities, ballpark, in 5 years could be out of business if they aren't able to collect revenue the way the DOJ describes.
I think it's quite possible. In looking at the St. Louis County region, we found 21 municipalities that got 20% or more of their budget from fines and fees. And when it's that significant a portion of your budget, it's going to be hard to make adjustments at that point. And some decisions that could have been made maybe 10, 20, 30 years ago and adjustments could have been made are kind of out of reach now. So it is very much a possibility.
A couple of things on that. One, the report said that it's not just that they get their money this way, but that they're budgeting that they'll get more the next year as well, $1 million more the next year.
Well, one of the issues that we face in St. Louis County is how do we adequately fund municipal governments? We have 90 municipalities in St. Louis County. Most of these were organized prior to 1950. So they were organized at a time when the economy was different, and these municipalities did have the ability to provide services. What we're finding now is that as wealth has moved farther west, as retail, as manufacturing has moved farther west, these municipalities no longer have the ability to provide services. And so the real issue is some of these municipalities have chosen to rely, unfortunately, upon law enforcement as a significant source of revenue. So Max Creek, if the state legislature does amend it, reduce the proportion of revenue that cities can keep, it'll have a profound impact.
Max Creek is a law that says 30% is the most of your budget that can come from traffic fines, which can be defined differently in different places, but they're talking about reducing it to, I think, 10%.
Yeah, I'd like to offer that we could imagine living in a community where police actually protect and serve and don't stop people so that we can generate revenue. I mean, I think that's the kind of world that we'd actually like to see. And so when we're talking about closing down municipalities, we're actually really having a conversation about how we change policing, right? And so policing is protecting and serving, not pulling people over to collect fines and fees. I mean, that is the kind of universe and world we're trying to live in, right? Because that is the world that some of us live in right now. So in some places, some people don't get pulled over because of their skin tone, and they're not being ticketed, fined, harassed because of their race.
Well, and in some places they don't get pulled over as much, period, regardless of if you go across the river, according to a recent report in the Post-Dispatch. Municipalities don't get the kind of money that you do on this side of the river from traffic fines, and police in Madison County, St. Clair County don't write as many tickets.
Wouldn't that be nice?
Sticking with the theme of data here that we've been talking about.
And I'd like to say something about the focus. Like we're talking about the economic impact, and Senator Schmidt's bill would reduce the cap from 30% to 10% on traffic-related tickets. So two things. One, it doesn't do anything about non-traffic tickets, right? It doesn't take a genius to figure out that the second we say you have to cap your revenue on traffic tickets, somebody's going to say, that $25 fee that we charge when you violate your ordinance for housing is now a $250 fee. And that'll hurt the poor people who are living in those communities even more than these tickets. The other thing is, I want to go back to something Chief Fitch said, and he's been very forthright about the fact that he sees this policing as an abuse of police power. But I find it problematic that in every interview I've ever seen him talk in, he says, this isn't the police's fault, it's the government's fault. Well, it's both people's fault, right? Like, if we live in a country where you can disobey an unlawful order. We live in a country where your continued employment is not as important as following the law. So if you're faced with being fired because you don't racially profile, and because you don't meet a quota system, and because you refuse to impose unlawful fees on people, so be it. Leave the job, right? And I think until we have a conversation where that discussion is added to it, that it's the police's responsibility not to participate in this, not just to say after the fact, it's the governmental agency telling me I should or should not do this, but rather I as a police officer am sworn to enforce the law, and this isn't what I signed up to do. I didn't sign up to be a ticket writer. I signed up to be a police officer. In a perfect world, I imagine police officers went to the academy to help communities, not to destroy them.
And I think that, it's really part of a larger discussion about how we operate as a region as well. The two most politically expedient ways to raise revenue and stay in power and continue to run a government is to go after sales tax or go after fines. Because why? People who vote for you don't necessarily get affected by those as disproportionately. If you ask for a property tax increase, your odds of getting reelected may be a little bit lower. So I think that we all need to take a look at why there's a need to treat people the way that we do in this region with our municipal court system. And it's a hunger for 90 municipalities, a city and a county. Everybody's kind of competing against each other, whether it's for retail, whether it's for fines. Everybody needs that revenue to survive because the system itself is flawed. There's systemic issues across our region.
Of course, they also say they get to know their mayor, and they get their street cleaned when they call their mayor, and they get their snow removed. There are a lot of people, even in north central St. Louis County, who don't want to let go of Felda Village or Uplands Park.
One thing to keep in mind is that all of these municipalities were created by the citizens. They're incorporations, so the public did vote to create them, and the public has the right to vote to disincorporate. So it's one thing for us to say there are too many municipalities. It's another thing to recognize that the power for disincorporation rests with the residents of each individual municipality. If they choose to disincorporate, they can. But regardless, the real issue is how do we fund services? The reason, and I'm not defending the municipalities at all, but one of the reasons they do write these tickets is to provide revenue for our streets, parks, other kinds of municipal services. So the underlying issue, I think you were correct, deals with how do we fund municipal government. Right now we have 61 municipal police departments in St. Louis County. That's a lot of police departments, and there's a certain inherent inefficiency. But at the same time, that's because the public wants them. Because they believe, the public argues that they have a higher degree of accountability if they have their own small municipal department. That's subject to debate.
I can't tell if Amy's shaking her head yes or no.
No, go ahead, let Thomas.
No, you go ahead.
I mean, I think at some point we are going to have to talk about, as a region, why we are separated like this and the ways that we are separated. and then move to a place where we are really trying to be neighbors with one another. I think at some point we're going to have to talk about racial covenants and why our suburbs were created. And it really wasn't so that we could be closer together as individuals and we could live in integrated communities, because we don't. And so at some point we're going to have that conversation, and then how it impacts our educational system, not to mention our police, right? So we're having this conversation about police, but that same policing practice happens in our schools as well, and it's disparate treatment again. So if we looked at suspension and expulsion rates, they look a lot like our police on the ground. And so, we're going to have to start having real conversations really about race, and then how we could be a region that is healthy, that is clear, that is committed to being a better region, which is incredibly possible, but we have to have honest dialogue about where we're going next.
Yeah, and I think that's what we hear from people as well, too. The Cardinals are in the World Series, everybody's from St. Louis. A shooting happens in Ferguson, and all of a sudden everybody's from the city, from Webster, from Kirkwood. And as a community, you live with each other through everything. And as a region, that's how you survive and how you thrive. And when you see strong regions in other places really growing, it's because they have that connectedness across their economy, across their communities.
One thing to keep in mind is that the reason the city of St. Louis is not in St. Louis County is back in 1876, the city wanted to avoid the problems of funding the financial burdens associated with a rural county, and so they withdrew. Those boundary lines were drawn, and we're still living with the effects of that. At the same time, a lot of municipalities were created specifically to provide services, specifically to maintain quality of life issues. And if you look at the last municipality incorporations that occurred in the late 1990s, again, they were drawn for a specific reason. So we have to look at our region and decide, what does the public really want, and how can we move this region forward within the context of the situation, the social, economic climate that we have.
I just want to say, we can't, when we talk about what the public wants, and when these towns were formed in 1950s, the public meant a very different thing than it means now. So when these towns were formed, it wasn't based on the vote of African Americans in our community. It was based on the vote of white folks who wanted to escape being around black folks. And that's the history of those towns. And we can't ignore that when we talk about this. Some of the very reasons where people want to have their own town is to exclude others from being in it. And as those folks moved even further west, and out into the further west suburbs, what we see is the vestiges of an apartheid-like structure that continues to infect our region, and that has to be removed.
I got to believe there are very few people in West St. Louis County or St. Charles County that believe they have anything to do with anything apartheid-like.
I'm sure they don't, but that's because they don't come into North County very often. That's because they left it. But the fact is, when I've been to the Southern Center for Human Rights and the Southern Poverty Law Center, they spent their entire careers fighting the KKK, put them out of business in Alabama. And when I told them about the municipal court structure, this was in 2010 when we just got started, they said, that's worse than what we see in Alabama. Southern Center for Human Rights said, that's worse than what we've ever seen in Georgia. So Missouri has the distinction of being worse than Alabama and Georgia in terms of how we treat the poor and African Americans in our region. And the New York Times talked to me, the first time I ever said this, to talk to them about this structure, they said, you've just described apartheid to me. So it's not Thomas Harvey who says this is apartheid. This is a feedback we get once we get out of our regional bubble and describe in a vacuum what we're talking about and what has come into place in our region. We may not like that term, and I get it. It's got a very serious connotation. But when you talk about the way this structure works and the people it impacts and the people it destroys, it kind of looks like it.
I would agree with you with much of what you say. It's important for us to keep in mind that the individuals that have the power in these small municipalities are African American, they're minority communities, and they have the right, should they so desire, to disincorporate. One of the issues we have is if we have, I'll pick a number, say we have 24 municipalities, African American, 24 African American mayors, 200 African American city council members. We'd like minority participation in the political process. If they consolidate, we have one mayor, we have 10 council members. Have we increased or have we decreased minority participation in the political process? That's a question. I do not have the answer for it, but that's an issue that we have to grapple with.
Hold on one second. We got gremlins in your microphone, so I don't want to cut off this excellent conversation, but let's take a look at social media, get some more input from that, fix the gremlins. We'll be right back and continue this conversation. Okay, as you can probably tell, we've got everyone back at the table. But Amy, I cut you off. I want to start with you.
Yeah, I would just offer that, we have an opportunity to do things differently here in St. Louis. And do I think the people in Chesterfield are trying to be in an apartheid state? I don't think they are. But what is clear is that we as a community are not a whole community. And so it is helpful and useful if we think of ourselves in holistic terms, meaning that if students or children are not graduating, if I told you 50% of the white children in Clayton were not going to graduate from high school this year, we as a community would do something different to make sure that that did not happen.
Or if that school was deemed failing, people who had the means would move out of Clayton.
That's right. Or if those students lived in a district that was unaccredited, that the students in Clayton would have somewhere to go. And so this gives us an opportunity to really work together as a region. I mean, the world is watching us right now. And it gives us a wonderful opportunity to say, you know what, we had Ferguson happen here, and this is what we did in response to it. This is what you can do in your local town and community as well. It is our moment that we could be proud of St. Louis, but we have to be clear and strategic, not just hopeful, but clear and strategic about how we move forward. And it takes honest conversation. It takes a lot of different people at the table. But we've got to stop defending kind of why we are where we are and say, this is where we are, and this is where we'd like to go. And be brave enough to imagine a world that we really want to live in, so that we want our kids to come home after college, so that people from all over the country are flocking here because we're just so amazingly awesome. Like, that's the community we want to create. And we can do it, but we have to do it together.
So if you read this DOJ report on Ferguson, or you listened to or read articles about it and were kind of shocked, maybe you have to kind of overlay it over all of us, and we've all learned to say it's not just a Ferguson problem, but it's not just a police problem, or it's not just a municipal court problem. And if you found that report shocking, what you guys are saying here now might be shocking to folks as well in terms of the state of affairs for the St. Louis region.
Well, everything is related. Municipalities are joined at the hip to school districts. If the school district is failing, the municipality will fail. If the economy fails, the municipality will fail. So everything's related. That's why on the Ferguson Commission, we have to look at police, we have to look at courts, but beyond that, we really have to look at economics, we have to look at growth, we have to look at expansion, and we have to look at education. So everything is interconnected. I think you're correct. And so that's a great challenge for us as a region. And we have such a history, and how do we begin to chart a different direction? That's the challenge for us.
Casey, there's an easy step that we could take tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock to solve a lot of the problems. I mean, I go away on a lot of the issues I've been outspoken about if one thing happened at 9 o'clock tomorrow, and that is municipalities in St. Louis County said, we're going to take jail off the table for municipal ordinance violations. Nobody goes to jail for a speeding ticket, or having weeds that are too high, or having improper tags. I mean, even in Ferguson now, where they're making some reforms, they're still saying that if you don't come to court, we're going to issue a warrant. So that means the 70-year-old lady who has worked hard all her life, maybe is a widow, and gets a ticket because she parked in the wrong place. If she misses a court date, we're going to issue a warrant, and if she gets pulled over again, we're going to arrest her.
I think the judge tonight said he didn't know any other way to get people to come to court.
Exactly, and that's the problem. And think about it, if we take jail off the table, we can't demand that people get public defenders, because you don't get a free lawyer if you're not going to jail. But the issue for the municipalities is it's expensive to jail people. So why are they spending money? They can't be coming out ahead by locking people up for 2 or 3 days because they can't post bond on a $200 speeding ticket. How does that make any sense? So,
and then the jail time doesn't go towards your account, so to speak.
Not always. Sometimes it does. They give them time served, but a lot of times it doesn't. But then the city's got to pay to jail the person. So if we took jail off the table, let them take a judgment, turn it over to a collection agency. There's a lot of ways to do it. Have a system where you take somebody's tax refund. A lot of people get tax refunds. I would not yell and scream about that system. What we're screaming about is people are going to jail because they can't post a bond on a speeding ticket. And you could change it tomorrow morning if we took jail off the table in Ferguson and everywhere else.
I have 2 more fixes that are harder. but the cops are with them, which is very hard to accomplish. Kevin Albrand, State Fraternal Order of Police president, also a Ferguson commissioner now, he said 2 things the cops agree with the protesters on are ticket quotas. Cops don't like to be driven to write tickets. Cops would support any movement to cut ticket quotas out of their game. Secondly, cops don't care how many police departments there are. There's going to be beat working cop jobs no matter how many white shirt jobs they have. So fewer, larger, more professional police departments would be fine with the cops. I think we could get a more efficient administration of police services where police officers were paid better, which would give you better applicants, and there were fewer administrative costs associated with chiefs.
And maybe the resources to train, something we haven't even talked about tonight, are the training recommendations for the Ferguson department alone. Some people are saying it could put them out of business, just the cost of the training that they're saying. We have about 30 seconds.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of this ties back to it's dollars and cents. You have police officers in this region that are making $11 an hour some places. And why are these practices in the courts still? Because it's about getting that revenue in. How do we get the money in? So the system is broken. I mean, when you have a discussion about municipal courts in the St. Louis region, what always comes up is the money and the revenue. It's not, you know, is this person getting a just verdict? And if there was any other level of court having this discussion on money, it would be ludicrous.
Hold that thought. We'll continue this conversation. Stay tuned.9net.org. Find us there online. Until next time on the air, stay tuned. Thanks. I cut you off. Did you finish your thought there? I'm sorry. Because I wanted to just double back, because we didn't quite talk about, Chief Fitch made a couple of other points. I think I didn't catch it exactly. I had it at one time and I missed it. 700 white male applicants, he said, to 30, I think. That's what I wrote down. 30 African-American applicants. That was definitely a head-shaking no.
I mean, until we change the way police function, it is hard to have, you know, people of color have to
carry the load?
Not carry the load, but berate, target people who look like them. You know, there's a scholarly word that's called fictive kinship, so you're my brother even though you're not my brother. And so, you know, as an African American, it would be difficult for me to enforce these unjust laws on people who look like me.
So that's why people aren't applying?
Absolutely. You know, it is, you know, I was teasing, but, you know, kind of like being an overseer. You know, nobody really wants that job. But if it were a protect and serve job, right, so you were really keeping communities safe and people safe and neighborhoods safe and building relationships with people who look like you, I think people would be interested in that job. You know, that's a great job to have. And I honestly think that's what police signed up for. It just isn't what's been happening, right? And so, you know, I think we have to change the way police function in communities, particularly in communities of color, before we start a recruiting effort.
I was going to say, this isn't exactly tied to police, but I met a woman over the weekend who had been, she's 40 years old. She has been arrested so many times on warrants for arrest for not paying fines. So many times she can't remember. She's been jailed over 20 times.
Just to be clear, because a lot of people, I just want to be clear. She had one offense.
That's right.
But multiple
and it's
arrests.
Failure to appear to pay fines.
So she broke the law originally once,
right.
and then she broke the
she
law
would say
not
maybe
showing.
not, but regardless. So she's been jailed 20 times, at least 20 times. She had her daughter with her, who was 10 years old, who has seen her mother be arrested 20 times for not paying fines. She and her mother lived in a car for 2 years. Every time her mother's arrested, she has to go where? Right? How would that little girl ever grow up to want to be a police officer or to trust the police officers? I mean, the police terrify her. She is literally afraid of the police because anytime she sees a cop car, she thinks, Mom's going to jail, and I don't know where I'm going. So I just don't, I mean, a lot of things would have to change before. You can quote those numbers and say we don't get enough applicants, right? And say, oh, well, black people don't want to be cops, and therefore we can't do anything about it. But there's a legitimate reason why a lot of folks wouldn't ever apply for that job.
One thing we didn't touch on is any of what's happened just with the resignations in Ferguson, the new judge being appointed. Are these, is this the wheel of change starting to turn, or is this anything at all significant, what you see?
Well, if it's turning, Casey, it's turning very slowly, okay? Municipalities, including Ferguson, have had a chance to fix it. Now, some of us older guys would say, they've had years and years to fix it. But since the death of Michael Brown, it's been 7 months. The cities in St. Louis County, there have been thoughtful discussions about reform. Frank Vatterott, the judge in Overland, has a committee. But we haven't seen implementation. We haven't seen the real change. There's thoughtful people saying, yeah, we're thinking about taking jail off the table. Do it. Get it off the table tomorrow. Don't let people go to jail on warrants for traffic tickets.
And just for some context, does that happen even in the rest of our state the way it does in St. Louis County? Or does it happen in the rest of the country the way it does in St. Louis County?
Well, the laws understand it. Thomas may be better on this, but if a police officer pulls somebody over and there's a warrant from another jurisdiction, they have to hold them. Or if they're in custody.
If that other jurisdiction wants to extradite.
If they're in custody, I think in a jurisdiction, they have to hold them. I think some officers, they have the discretion to say you have a warrant somewhere, go clear it up. But once they've taken them in for their city, they can't release them if somebody else has a
Well, I
hold
guess maybe I'm talking more about what the warrant is for.
Well, I want to be clear. I don't think it's necessarily the problem. And I don't think John does either. I don't think the problem is necessarily the warrant. Say you missed your court date, and they've issued a warrant for your arrest. Maybe that is the only option. There are other options, but maybe that's the option you choose. Once they get you into custody, and you say, I don't have the $900 I owe in fines. They can't hold you simply because you owe them money. And that's what they're doing. And we know that because if they paid the $900, they'd walk out of there. And sometimes they'd never even have to go to court again. I mean, in some fictional world, this is a new case. The failure to appear is a new case, and you'd have to appear in court to resolve that. But in a lot of places, you pay the $900 you owe, you don't go to court, you don't go back to court, right? So these people are literally being held hostage and being ransomed, right? So the first day they're in there, it's $900. The next day in there, someone comes in and says, well, you got $400? We'll let you go today if you have $400. How is that about public safety? How is that about anything other than squeezing an already marginalized community for the last pennies it has? And not just the individual, but the whole family. It destroys that whole family and the whole community.
And I was talking to somebody who had a failure to appear because she had to work. And so she called ahead to see if it could reschedule, but it couldn't. And so she understood that she was going to have to go back to the police department the next day and pay, this is her second time because she's working, and pay $300 more. And so she's just paying the city because she has to work because she can't make the court. That's ludicrous.
And the report offered, I think, as a counter to the idea that don't break the law, you won't be in this place in the first place. It cited situations where they weren't even actually given a ticket, and then the court stopped mailing out warrants to save postage.
Yep.
So you weren't even notified that you had that you had a warrant.
I think
that's kind of seems like a no situation. I think anybody could just about agree on that.
Well, I think the biggest glaring issue with the Ferguson report is it's the Ferguson report. What our data shows is this is systemic. This is not a Ferguson issue. If you fixed everything in Ferguson, you'd have a very nice island amidst a sea of other municipalities that do the same things. If you had asked, I think, anyone a year ago, and given them 20 guesses as to where something like that took place in August would happen in the fallout, Ferguson wouldn't have even been in the top 20. Yeah. I think that the data in terms of how much revenue they bring in, the warrants, the operations, I think that really wouldn't have been on people's minds. It's a much broader issue. So you can fix Ferguson, but if that's all you do, you're just putting a new spark plug in a car that has a bad transmission. It's just not going to fix things.
One of the issues is, and the failure to appear really is something that's referred to as a round robin, where you move from court to court to court, and that's something that we desperately need to remedy. And the round robin really is in fact based on failure to appear, where you get picked up in one municipality and you have to go to, you may not know where you ultimately wind up, and you can spend 2 or 3 days, at a minimum, trying to clear these warrants up, and that really is a problem. But again, keep in mind that they could go away tomorrow if the municipalities, the mayors, the city councils would say we're not going to do that anymore. And that's where the action, we really need to deal with these elected officials and say eliminate these bench warrants. And if the municipalities do that, they can go away. that's really a remedy that should be adopted, because that really hinders employment, it hinders family, it really hurts our region as a whole.
Yeah, you mentioned there are other consequences for not paying your bills. I mean, these are not DWI charges we're talking about. In some cases, they were your grass is too tall charges.
Right.
Might end up in jail for.
If I have a second.
Yeah.
The mayor's exactly right. The system we have has sucked millions out of the economy to give to municipalities. So the illegal fines that people have paid to Ferguson and Fenton and Beverly Hills and other municipalities, if the people had not had to pay those illegal fines, they could have been buying furniture, gas for the car, shoes for the kids.
Well, rent in some cases.
Right, rent to live,
Rent,
pay the light bill.
we have sucked millions of dollars out of the economy and given it to municipal courts, and this has been bad for the economy. Back to your other question, though, about other parts of the state. Unless the person's from St. Louis County, they're not going to have these kind of warrants. People in rural Missouri don't have warrants out against them. You know, they're not driving around looking over their shoulder, worrying about being stopped and going to jail and having their kids go to foster care. This is not a concern in Cape Girardeau. This is not a concern in Joplin, Missouri. You know, this is primarily a St. Louis problem. It is a problem sometimes some other places, but you know, we haven't heard some big outcry that this is a problem in the rural areas of the state.
Final thought on how we have these hard conversations. We're about out of time, but you mentioned that you just got to like deal with some of these things head on. I mean, can you give us any action items for talking about race tomorrow with our friends?
Yeah, I mean, of course, at the YWCA, we have 8 Witnessing Whiteness groups going right now, and they're just for white people to talk about race and learn about racism and what they can do as allies in white space. And they're free. All you have to do is buy the book. So that's part of the strategy and solution to kind of have advocates within our community that are not just smart, but thoughtful and strategic around educating ourselves around race so that it's a more natural conversation. No social problem solved with silence, and this one won't be either.
Maybe even just the lingo. I mean, like sometimes I'm afraid to say the wrong thing sometimes.
Yeah.
But as a framing issue, though, like I think we have some law students from the University of Chicago School of Law and Columbia School of Law here in town. We've been talking a lot about these issues. They're shocked at what they see. But the reality is it comes down to a framing device. And if you start with a lot of our issues are racism and capitalism and move from there, you see this whole region's existence in a very different way, as well as the United States. I mean, let's not pretend. Like, there's a lot of treating African Americans as capital, as property, that's at the origins of our country. And we're not doing that as much anymore, but this is a vestige of what we're talking about. So if you are honest about that, and I don't think that doesn't cast aspersions on people living today, right? That's just the reality of America. And it's something to keep in mind when we're thinking about this.
Let me just add to your comment about it's not a problem in outstate Missouri. I believe that's one of the reasons we may not be able to rely on Jeff City to solve the problems because the legislators from outstate don't see it as a problem and they view it as a problem unique to St. Louis County, which it really is. So that's why I keep arguing. My belief is we need to clean our house internally. And I think discussions with local officials, municipalities, we can move this thing forward. You mentioned Frank Vatterot's efforts. There is movement. I think the fact that the associate judge is here, we're going to see some change. And you're right, taking the failure to appear off the table will solve 80%. It won't solve it all, but it'll solve 80% of our problems.
Senator Schmidt actually has a bill that would do that down there now, and I can tell you that reducing the cap from 30 to 10% was voted out 34 to nothing in the Senate. So there is movement in the state, and I think that we need to look on all fronts to fix this problem. I don't think there's one magic solution to any of it.
Guys and lady, thank you all for your time. I appreciate your insights.
Thank you.